I came to the US to flee the study of medicine. And shortly after I arrived, I realized that for many Americans, an African immigrant was a person who was fleeing catastrophe, war, or extreme poverty, someone who grew up with nothing or whose village had been burned down. I was baffled by how often Americans expected me to be able to talk about my experience with poverty, because they automatically assumed that to be African was to be poor. The story of catastrophe and poverty in Africa is very important, and it should be told. But it is not my story, and it is not the only story of Africa. What I read as a very young child were British and American books. I was also an early writer. At the age of 6, I was writing multiple-page stories in pencil with crayon illustrations. And I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They ate apples and played in the snow. They drank ginger beer because the British characters in the books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. My characters also talked about the weather, like the characters in the books I read, even though I could not understand for the life of me what people actually said when they talked about the weather. In my world, the sun was always out, except for when it rained, and then the sun was out again. In my world, people were black and ate mangoes and did not have snow. But I was a child, and like all children, I was vulnerable in the face of a story. Because I had not seen myself reflected in books, I did not think that people like me could be in books. I loved those British and American books. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not consciously, actively know that little girls like me, little girls with skin the color of chocolate, could also exist in literature. Things changed when I discovered African writers. Because of writers like Kamaralai and Chinua Achebe, I slowly went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I began to write stories about people who looked like me and did things that I recognized. What that discovery did for me was that it saved me from having a single story of what books are. Writing is what gives my life meaning. I love the solitude of writing. I love the near mystical sense of creating characters who sometimes speak to me. I love the possibility of touching another human being with my work. I love spending a large amount of time in the spaces between the imaginary and the concrete. The British playwright Harold Pinter once said that when he was unable to write, it was like being separated from himself. And I could not agree more. All of this is to say that stories formed me. I don't remember a time when I wasn't drawn to stories, to reading them, writing them, finding them. I have this memory from childhood, sitting in the backseat of my mother's car, looking out of the window, and suddenly feeling a melancholy pang, a kind of muted mourning, because what I saw through the window as we drove were stories, so many stories waiting to be told, and I knew that I would not be able to tell them all. I did well in school, and like all children who did well in school, I was expected to become a doctor. I didn't want to be a doctor. All I wanted to do was to write and read stories. But I also knew that I was not likely to earn a living by reading and writing stories. So I decided that I would indeed go ahead and become a doctor. I had it all planned out. I would become a psychiatrist, and during the day I would work as a psychiatrist, and then at night I would use my patient stories for my writing. I mean, I didn't think about the ethics of it. But, but, but after a year of medical school, when I found myself so bored in class that I was writing poetry at the back of my notebooks, I knew I had to leave. The Nigerian Nobel laureate in literature, Wole Soyinka, once said that the need to write comes from a sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo and a belief that things can be better, more just, more equal than they are. And so to write is in some ways to seek higher ground, to show what is possible, to let some light into that which in us is dark, to show how we can be, how we should be. I think of literature as my religion, and I have learned from literature that there is no such thing as perfection, that we are all flawed, all of us human beings are flawed, but that we do not need first to be perfect before we can do what is right. I have learned from literature that we human beings are not a collection of logical flesh and bones. We are also emotional beings. For every human being in the world, dignity and pride matter as much as bread and water. And I have learned to look at the world through the lens of the human story. I recently heard somebody say, well, if you don't want to be separated from your kids at the border, then don't bring your kids to the border. But if we look at that comment through the lens of the human story, it becomes something else, a story of love, a story of a parent saying, I want more for you, I want better for you, and I am determined to try everything I can to achieve that. Shortly after my first novel was published, an American professor told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was perfectly willing to accept that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were middle class. They drove cars, they were not starving, therefore, they were not the real Africa. He was an American who felt he could decide what the real Africa was. Because my book did not fit into his single story of Africa, he had decided that it was inauthentic. I wondered what he would say if somebody told him that the story of his life in a middle-class American suburb was not the real America because it was not about food deserts in the inner city or malnourished children in Appalachia. But I must add that I too am just as guilty on the subject of the single story. Years ago, I visited Mexico for the first time from the US. And the political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. As often happens in this country, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. Mexicans were all portrayed through a singular lens of negativity. There were stories about Mexicans fleecing the healthcare system, bringing disease, similar to what is happening today, but perhaps not quite as poisonous. I remember walking around Guadalajara on my first day there, admiring the architecture, the market, watching the people going to work, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. This is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. We must seek the higher ground of multiple stories, many stories, as a way of reminding ourselves of our common humanity. We are unfamiliar with one another, I think, because we are unfamiliar with the stories of one another. I recently got an honorary degree from a prestigious liberal arts college here in the US, which was very lovely. And the limo driver, an older white man who picked me up from the airport, was chatty and nice, even if a little overfamiliar. He asked what I did for a living, and I said I was a writer. I don't read books, he said, but even if I read books, I wouldn't read or know about books like yours. Why do you say that? I asked. Oh, I just know I wouldn't, he said. Because you think I write about things that won't interest you, I said. Yes, he said. We both knew what he meant, black things and woman things. I thought that this was a moment of remarkable honesty on the subject of identity in America. What struck me first was sadness for him. Poor guy, I thought. He'll miss out on all the wonderful writing of women like Toni Morrison and Arundhati Roy. And then I thought about how the reverse could never happen. I read books by white men all the time. Some of my favorite writers are white men. In this society, white maleness is seen as the norm, and we think of white male writers writing about so wide a range of things that we cannot assume what they write about merely by looking at them. And when they do write about white things and male things, we think of those things as universal, which is really how we should think about all good literature. I know from a lifetime of loving books that any story, if done well, becomes universal. Because in telling stories, we appeal to that which is human in all of us. I grew up reading books from all parts of the world, and even though I sometimes didn't understand every specific detail about, say, Russia in the novel Fathers and Sons, I still got the human story. A friend of mine, a man from Western Europe, recently told me that he had bought Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming, as gifts for his women friends. Why only for your women friends? I asked. Why not for your male friends? And he looked slightly taken aback. Now, that memoir, Becoming, is a compulsively readable and gorgeously honest book, one that I think many men would benefit from reading. In fact, there's a wonderful passage about the first kiss between Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, which I think would be a great blueprint for consent. Just saying. So another time, I was talking to a friend who loves rock music and had read many rock memoirs. And so I asked him, have you read Patti Smith's lovely memoir? He said no. Now, this friend is a good and kind man, but to him, the stories of women belong to another universe entirely. We know statistically that men read men, while women read men and women. It is time to change that. It is time to reach for the higher ground of multiple stories where all stories are given the same level of dignity. It is time to place the stories of women and the stories of any kind of minority group where they rightly belong on the universal shelf. I believe that if more men read women's stories, then communication would be better between men and women. And dare I be overly optimistic and say that if men read more women's stories, it would lead to reduced rates of male violence against women, which today is an epidemic almost everywhere in the world. Human stories force us to see people as human, as whole beings. Female socialization all over the world is remarkably similar, and a major component of female socialization is shame. Women are socialized to be familiar with shame, with their periods, their bodies, and even about what they cannot control, which is the reaction of men to their bodies. And it is impossible to understand how women navigate the world without understanding this. And we cannot understand this unless we read and hear the stories of women as told by women themselves. We must seek the higher ground of equalizing the value of all stories, of not relegating the stories of any group to the shelf of niche or the shelf of special interest. There is a particular sense of validation and joy and pleasure that comes from reading stories that are about our own particular experiences, and nobody should ever be denied that. But it is as important that we read stories that are not about our own particular experiences. A student once asked me, will you always write about Nigeria, or will you write about more normal things? And what struck me was that he had a sense of what was normal, and Nigeria was not part of this normal. This student was not evil. He meant well. But we can mean well and be wrong. Economic superiority is a fact of our existence, but it can also sometimes give birth to a certain kind of casual moral superiority. Some parts of the world have such cultural and economic power that they end up defining normal for everyone else. It is time to widen our ideas of what is normal. In my language, Igbo, the word for love is ifunanya, and its literal translation is to see. It is important to see those about whom we speak. It is important to remember that human beings all share a desire to be valued, a desire to matter. We want our bodies to be nourished. We also want our hearts to be nourished. We will be unable to understand people if we speak of them only in terms of their need. We must speak of their need because that's important, but also we must speak of what they love, what they resent, what wounds their pride, what they aspire to, what makes them laugh. We should read human stories to remind ourselves that we are not alone, to remind ourselves that we, in the wonderful words of the poet Pablo Neruda, belong to this great mass of humanity, not to the few, but to the many. And especially today that is politically fraught, we must seek the higher ground of multiple stories as a rebuke to despair. We cannot afford despair. We cannot afford hopelessness. We cannot afford cynicism. We cannot afford the defeat of our human spirit. We cannot lose sight of the enduring importance of compassion and kindness.